Hey everybody, it's Dan. Welcome back and welcome to this review of the newly released Wargames Atlantic Mounted Sergeants, which were just released in conjunction with their Mounted Knights that we reviewed a little bit earlier this week. Both these boxes were sent to me courtesy of Wargames Atlantic to take a look at with you guys, so big thanks to them for sending this our way. And I'll kind of maybe speed run some of the notes that I made on the Mounted Knights review, and I do recommend you watch that if you haven't, just because I'm probably going to be making more than one reference to it throughout the course of this video, but just for the sake of completedness, I'm going to make a couple of brief notes on particularly the box art that I mentioned in the Mounted Knights review has totally changed. So the infantry sets all have like a parchment colored background. It says Age of Chivalry up in the top, and Baron's War is only listed on the side. With these new boxes, both cavalry sets, you'll see it's a black-white split, and now it's Baron's War 2nd edition listed up in the upper left-hand corner. So I like this. I think this is much more striking, and I think it's an improvement over what I thought was already a very good box design in their Age of Chivalry sets. And some had mentioned in the comments of the Mounted Knights video that they think it's because Footsore Miniatures has a much more prominent role with Wargames Atlantic now, at least for this range, so they might have had a hand in this box redesign. As I said, I think this is an improvement. It was already great, so certainly not a problem to have this new box art. On the back, you've got some completed models here and a little blurb about what's going on historically at the time. And again, these aren't to scale if you're not familiar with these miniatures, but just something to note. So yeah, I think that at least from the box art, they all look fantastic. Nice illustration over here on the left. 12 miniatures in this box, which is pretty standard for this price point. What I've done here is I've already taken out the contents, as I've done in most of my recent reviews. And I'll say, again, if you're not familiar with my reviews, that what we're going to do is take a look at all these bits up close here. I'll give you some close-up shots of everything. We're going to assemble some of them. I like to do some kit bashing with other stuff in my collection, especially the Age of Chivalry infantry sets. And we'll do some scale comparisons, and then I'll give you my final thoughts. I mentioned in the Mounted Knights review that this is the first two sets, anyway, of Wargames Atlantic kits that include bases. Again, I think it's because they have a much stronger affiliation now with Baron's War, and these are Baron's War compliant bases. And yeah, they look great. So again, 12 bases for 12 models. These round holes, others had speculated in that Mounted Knights review down in the comments that these must be for magnets. As I said, nice to have them included, even if you're not going to use them. So it is a similar layout inside, as there's 4 sprues of riders and 4 sprues of horses, as opposed to 3 and 3 in the Mounted Knights. But what we can do here is isolate one of each to take a look at up close. These horses, just so you're aware, are from their Light Horses box, and it's used in a couple of other boxes too, I think in their like Renaissance or Conquistador Cavalry. There's several boxes that now use this sprue. It confused me at first because I thought actually that it was 2 pieces of one sprue that was broken apart, but when I lined them all up, I saw that all 4 of these are actually identical. So it is just that sprue. So you got 4 copies of one sprue that looks like this. So let's take a look at the horses here first, like we did with the Mounted Knights, just because it's a comparatively simple sprue. And you can see here that there are 3 horse designs, and there are 4 head options that we'll take a look at here in just a moment. They did a similar thing here that they did with, well, with the Mounted Knights, of course, but also they do it a lot with their kits that have firearms, where you have to have a dedicated left arm with a specific right arm, just so that it'll match up properly. They've done the same thing here with these heads, where you can see that there's a numbering and a lettering system here that matches up with a particular head, and that's because these kind of quirky looking bits down here are the harness. It's the reins of the horse, or the bridle. Again, I don't know horse harness terminology, so I just roll with it. But this goes to a specific head, and then these heads are all interchangeable with these bodies. So it gives you actually a lot of variety, even though there are 3 horse bodies, which is totally normal. I think that's fairly standard when we're talking about 12 cavalry models. But that you can then mix and match 4 different heads across 3 bodies. It gives you a ton of variety that you can achieve within a unit. So that's pretty cool. Sculpting's all fantastic. Again, if you're familiar with this sprue, you'll know the horses are a little bit smaller. We'll take a look at scale toward the end of the video. They're a little bit smaller than like the Mounted Knights that we just took a look at, but I think this is a fantastic frame. So again, 4 of those, 12 horses, and then we'll take a look at the rider's sprue. So straight away, what I should mention again, there are 4 riders sprues per set because there are only 3 riders per sprue. And what that means is that all the bits, like the numbers I'm about to give you, are multiplied by 4, which becomes pretty staggering when we start talking about like some of the head options, some of the weapon options. We'll get there, but just remember everything I'm listing is going to be multiplied by 4 because I typically give numbers per sprue. So let's do a shot of the front and back here, and then we'll take a look at some of these bits up close. So the bodies, you may see, are now identical to the Mounted Knights in that they are one piece as opposed to the Foot Sergeants, if you're familiar with that box, which had the torsos and the legs detached. And I mentioned in the Mounted Knights review that I think this makes sense here only because there's not a lot of people are going to want to be like pivoting torsos in saddles, and I think it would have made it too finicky maybe from a sculpting standpoint to achieve some of this level of detail if those 2 pieces were detached. But yeah, good variety of attire, armor. Again, there's like some padded options over here, just regular like hauberks or tunics. Chainmail coifs on all 3, so they're slightly more heavily armored than like a just peasant riding a horse. I don't know if they have any intention of releasing something like that down the road where you've now got like a mounted version of the Foot Sergeants, which is like medium armor, mounted version of course of the Foot Knights, which is heavy armor. I'm wondering if they're going to put out like a box of Scouts down the road as a mounted version of the peasants, but I think we can probably pull off something pretty close to that just with some kit bashing, but we'll see. So again, I think these all look fantastic. And then let's talk about heads. So there's 15 heads per sprue, so 60 heads per box for 12 models. And I do like to kind of throw them in buckets or categories here. So again, 15 heads, they're broken up as 7 of these kettle-style helms. So you would have to have 8 of the models in the unit with this head style before you add a duplicate, which is pretty impressive. There are 6 just regular armored helms. And I did take a look. I had mentioned that I thought all the heads on the Foot Knight and the Mounted Knights sprues were the same, and they are. And I did the same check here where I actually pulled in one of my Foot Sergeant frames, and I looked at every single head and cross-referenced it between the sprues. So all the heads on this are the same, or at least all of these heads can be found on the Foot Sergeant's sprue. And I mentioned in the Mounted Knights that doesn't bother me because there's so much variety here that I really don't need much more. And somebody pointed out in the comments of the Mounted Knights video that also can be seen as kind of a feature, right? Where if you want to have a mounted and a foot version of the same model, you can do that very easily because you have the same heads in both of those kits. So I mentioned there are 6 of these regular armored bodies, again 15 total heads, 7 of the kettle style, 6 of just these kind of like earlier medieval, maybe like First, Second Crusade, and then there are 2 more down here. Conical nasal style helms, a little bit of chainmail, looks good. And there are 2 just with these skull caps. So again, 15 heads total, and I think they all look great. I didn't mention it in this video yet, but Wargames Atlantic is fantastic from a production standpoint. They have very little mold lines, like in the spots where you would expect them on the side of a figure. Everything looks really good. So we talked about heads, let's talk about right arms. So there are 16 right arms, which is a lot of right arms for 3 bodies, and they're broken up as these spear options, some of which are in a couched position, some of which are just like upright. And you can see a good mix of this padded sleeve versus a chainmail sleeve, which honestly I think any could go on any, the way that these are equipped. Obviously the padded ones are kind of designed to go with this one in particular, but I've got no issue mixing and matching. So it's good to have a bit of variety there, bit of options. So again, like even if you're just sticking with this padded arm, you've got an upright version and you've got a couched version. So cleverly built that way, I think. So 6 spear options you've got. Everything else is broken up among hand weapons. So there are actually 3 maces, so you can have the entire unit armed with maces if you wanted to. So there's 2 of this padded arm style, and there's 1 chainmail. There are then 2 picks down here, 1 axe. And again, pay attention to the padding versus the chainmail. There are 2 arming swords, so there's 1 up here, and there's 1 over here. And then 2 that are this like falchion style blade, 1 here, and then 1 up here. So the only thing of note there is, again, I mentioned pay attention to the chainmail. I think the chainmail arms could really go on any of these bodies, but it means if you're trying to stick with like this guy only having padded arms, you're slightly more limited in terms of what he could be equipped with, because you'll see that there are 2 mace options that are padded. There's this 1 axe, right, and the spear that I had mentioned before. So if you wanted everybody in the unit armed with a sword, for example, and you also cared about this guy having padded sleeves, you can't really do that. It's obviously a minor quibble. Yeah, the only thing that maybe surprised me, not disappointed me, but surprised me was that there's no ranged weapon option on these. And I thought there would at least be like a crossbow, like we saw with the foot sergeants, maybe just a regular bow option, something like that. Just because there's so many hand weapon options, I feel like you could have swapped 1 or 2 of those out for just 1 or 2 maybe ranged weapon options. But as I said, I'll do some kit bashing here with some of the bits from both of those infantry sets that had ranged weapons, and we'll see if those work here. Some shield options down here, so there's 2 per body. You can see there's the shorter shield design and then a longer heater shield design. And I misspoke in the mounted knights. There were 8 per sprue in that one. I think I put a little asterisk down in the review, but it's the same thing there, which is great for just padding out a bits box, that there are 2 shield options per body in both of the mounted sets. So that's pretty cool. There are, speaking of padding out your bits box, there are 5 scabbards for 3 bodies, 3 of which are this Falchion style kind of cleaver design, 2 of which are the arming sword. And there are these 3 saddle pieces that we know there's a 2-part saddle design with Wargames Atlantic figures. So these go here, and then these plop down on top of the saddles on the horses. And there you go, that's the sprue. So I think this is really fantastic as they sit. As I said, I want to do some kit bashing with some of the infantry sets, and we'll see what we can come up with here. Alright, a couple of housekeeping notes here. So on the left, I've got a horse from the Mounted Knights kit. On the right, I've got a horse from the Mounted Sergeants kit. So you can see the Mounted Sergeant horses, the light horses, are a little bit smaller. I still think there's an issue with the tail length, maybe even more noticeable on this guy than even on this one. So I'm still going to cut some of these down, but I think that they're beautifully sculpted. I think they look great. It's just the tail length's a little bit long for me. So the reason that's important is because I also wanted to see how interchangeable the riders were. So like this is a knight on the left, right? And this is actually a mounted sergeant with knight bits. So I used the head and the arms from the mounted knight kit to make like kind of like a poorer knight, right? So I think that looks cool in and of itself. But what I found is that while the knights can go on light horses, if that's something you're trying to do, they fit without any issue. What I found is that the horses are actually too big for the mounted sergeants, so you really can't. See, there's like a gap there. You could kind of pull it apart, maybe use a little bit of green stuff to make it fit, but there's a gap there because these legs were designed to go on a slightly smaller horse, right? So anyway, just something to be aware of if you're looking to kit bash between these 2 sets. Again, mounted knights can go on the light horses seemingly without any issue, and you're going to need to do a little bit of green stuffing and snipping in order to get the mounted sergeants to fit on the heavy horses. So that piece out of the way. What I do want to talk about though is one other note that jumped out at me only when I was putting these together, which is that I mentioned there are all 3 bodies with these chainmail coifs, right? And that's important because there are actually 6 heads, I think that I count, that have cloth connection points. And that's in part because they copied some of these heads over from the foot sergeant sprue. And that's not an issue with the foot sergeants because you've got several that don't have chainmail around the neck. The issue here is that those 6, you'll end up, if you use them, you're going to end up with a cloth connection point on the head attached to a chainmail connection point on the neck. This is similar to the issue that we saw with the peasant levy, where they had some on the like supplemental weapon accessory sprue that had chainmail sleeves that would then attach to an armorless body. And they made up for it in that kit by including 2 of that sprue. In this case, the way that I compensate for that is the fact that there's still 9 heads per sprue that have a chainmail connection point. So that's still a 3-to-1 head ratio, even if you're not dipping into other kits. Still plenty of heads to use within this set just for these riders. But I also think my strong recommendation is that if you're picking this kit up, I think Wargames Atlantic intended for you to use these kits together. What you've got on the right is the Foot Sergeant sprue, and forgive my hand paint. I was playing with my daughter. So what what I think they wanted you to do is use these kits in conjunction, because there are, I said 15 heads here, and some of the heads, those 6 with cloth connection points, could be used over here as duplicates, but there's actually 27 heads on the foot sergeants, which means you could actually harvest more bits to add even more variety over here. There's even a couple of bits that I'll show you in a second that I think are actually specifically designed to go on horses. So I don't know if it was placed on the wrong sprue by accident or what, but it also lets you use some weapon bits from here, like a crossbows on the riders, and over here you've got some weapon options like these picks, like this axe, that aren't on the foot sergeants that I think would be very useful on the foot sergeants, not to mention some of these spear options I think would be pretty cool. So all that is to say that if you're already going in on this, my recommendation is you just pick up both kits, because I think there's a lot of utility from both of them, and I think they become exponentially better from the bits from one another. So anyway, enough of that. Let me just show you some of these finished figures here, and then we'll do some scale comparisons. Again, I still think the tails are a little bit long, but I think that this is a beautiful, beautiful figure. They all look great. And these shields, I really hope they put out a kit of just like these shields, because I think they're so useful and they look fantastic. A lot of movement in these. So here, like, here's the first figure I put together that has some bits from the foot sergeants. So you can see it was no issue at all. Dropped on, no green stuff needed, no cutting needed. So again, these bits are meant to be interchangeable and used together, I think. And then look at this. See this like bedroll? This is on the foot sergeant sprue. So again, I don't know if that was a mistake. There's also like a flask that almost looks like it's supposed to be attached to his saddle. Or if it was just they figured most people are going to be picking these up together, and you can kind of use them however you want. But yeah, that bedroll is on the foot sergeant sprue. So very easy to make your own like mounted crossbowman there, and then I'll bring this guy back in too. Again, this is using some of the mounted knight bits on the mounted sergeant body. So yeah, very useful kit. I think it's fantastic. Let me bring in some scale comparisons like we did with the mounted knights and see how they stack up. Alright, here we go. So quick spin on the Lazy Susan here just to show off the scale of these figures compared to some other ones in my collection here. So I guess let's start in the center here. So crossbow guy is a mounted sergeant figure. And then we're on to Fireforge games. There's some Victrix bits in there, but the horse and body are Fireforge. Got a couple of infantry models from 5th edition Britonia and Wargames Atlantic Foot Sergeants. Got another mounted sergeant figure there. That's actually a Games Workshop. I think it's 5th edition plastic horse anyway. Those have been around for a long time. We've got a Wargames Atlantic mounted knight next to a mounted sergeant there. Show the difference in the horse scale. Perry Miniatures horse. Victrix mounted knight, and we're back to Wargames Atlantic sergeant. So what's the verdict? I think this is a really cool kit. I know there's a couple of quirks about it. Again, if the tail length bothers you, I think that's very easily fixed just with a little bit of cutting. The heads, I mentioned, if that's something that bothers you, there's still plenty of heads within the set to use just the chainmail ones without having to dip into other sets. But as I also said, I think this kit becomes so much exponentially better if you use it in conjunction with the foot sergeants, which completely eliminates the head issue because you can then start using bits in both directions. So I think it's just really cool. I think there's just so much utility in the core concept of like medium early medieval cavalry, right? Not just within the Barons War, which this is obviously branded for, but I'm thinking about like Middle Earth strategy battle game. I'm thinking about Warhammer Bretonian alternatives. I'm thinking about like a Song of Ice and Fire miniatures, right? There's just so much potential here for the core of this set for use beyond just the Barons War. It's just nice to have another option to draw from. So if you're enjoying these reviews, if you're finding them helpful and you're considering picking anything up based on them, I would be immensely grateful if you would consider using the affiliate link down in the description, because a portion of your purchase is going to come right back to this channel to help fund future reviews. As ever, I appreciate you guys dropping by for this one, and until next time, happy gaming.